when you look at the situation and the tensions in the relationship, mentioned prominently during the presidential visit by Felipe Calderón, what's the state of play?
Well, it's definitely strained on many issues, not only drugs. Certainly, President Calderón has been very assertive in the need for the United States to do something, describing the drug war as not only a Mexican problem and not only a Latin American problem, but mostly an American consumption problem. And he is right in pointing the finger towards the United States on that. However, there's little the United States can do unless it moves towards a totally different direction, which is legalization of drugs, which is not going to happen, at least here in Washington. But on other fronts, there is also problems. You have trade, for example. One of the first things that this Congress did when they assumed office in 2010 was to strike down the pilot program that allowed Mexican truckers into the United States, and that led Mexico to retaliate with tariffs on over 100 products, American products. And those tariffs are still in place. Mexican truckers are still not allowed into the United States, and that shows that definitely the level of comfortableness between both countries is not at its highest.
One aspect of U.S.-Mexican trade the president did speak about was that in heavy weaponry. He asked for a reimposition of the assault weapons ban. Doesn't look like he's going to get it.
No, if you look at it, I mean, the president everyone is pretty much aware right now that the border can't be sealed. It can't be sealed for drugs. It can't be sealed for people. Are we actually expecting the border to be sealed for guns? And that number, when you look at that number, that 90% of guns were confiscated in Mexico come from the United States. That number has a caveat, and the problem is that 90% of traceable guns that people get in Mexico are from the United States. But the number of guns overall that are not traceable is huge. So when you only take into account all guns and not only traceable guns, you see that only 17% of guns used in Mexico.
So you're saying there's a Mexican gun problem, but it's not all of American origin.
Exactly.
This week, President Calderón went on national television and gave a full-length address to his people, sort of laying out the situation. And the United States came in for some attention during this speech. It was noted that it's like having a drug addict living next door in your neighborhood, which I thought was a very homey and easy to understand way of illustrating the situation. He called for suppression of use in the United States. We've been trying to suppress the use of drugs since the 1960s with the creation of what's now the drug czar. The first drug czar appointed by Richard Nixon in the late 60s. It hasn't worked. If Mexico is waiting for the United States to fix the problem by suppressing drug addiction, I'm not sure Mexico's got much of a chance of getting this problem solved. He also asked for help with the weapons. And, it is a reminder. When you watched the speech to the Mexican people, it was a reminder of just how much of this is a Mexican problem, but a Mexican problem only made worse by the situation in the United States. Is that fair, Katie?
I would say absolutely so. President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have both acknowledged that the U.S. consumption problem is the biggest challenge facing the Mexican drug war right now. And unless, the political climate in Washington is willing to accept legalization as a viable alternative, I really don't see how we can move away from this militarization.
And Secretary Clinton, in that same speech, said, if you're thinking about legalization, forget it.
Right.
We're not thinking about it.
She basically laughed at the former presidents of Latin America, including President Zedillo, who recommended that we move toward a policy of legalization in the hemisphere as a whole, and who stated that the drug war is a failure.
Well, let's see if Secretary Clinton and the administration are going to be laughing after November when California is likely to pass a referendum legalizing marijuana. And then we will see some people getting nervous here in Washington, because what will be the reaction south of the border, where thousands of people are dying every year, trying to contain drugs coming into the United States, and then the largest state of the union says, you know what, we're going to legalize marijuana. Then that's gonna change the relationship.
Be a challenge.
I think there
Katie,
are.
when President Calderon was in the United States, he did something quite unusual for a visiting head of state. He directly criticized an American legislature in an individual state that passed a law, namely Arizona and SB 1070. Did that just add fuel to an already burning fire?
Etc.
Juan Carlos, I'm assuming you came here legally.
I came here legally, but and I believe that there should be a program here in the United States that allows all these unskilled workers to come here and work legally. And there used to be one back in the 50s. There was the Braceros program that allowed Mexicans to come here for a few months and work in seasonal agricultural farms, and then go back to Mexico. And under that program, illegal detentions in the border dropped by 90%, which shows that if given a chance, Mexicans will come here legally. They will pay their dues. They will pay whatever they need to pay in order to come here and work legally. Being illegal here in the United States is not something people aspire to, you know.
Well, one of the most commonly heard arguments in this debate is that we wouldn't be mad if you played by the rules and if you get at the end of the line. And people on the other side of the argument say, well, there is no line and there's not really rules. Because rules that take 15 years or 12 years to get in here aren't really rules. They're just a dare to come illegally, because you can't wait 12 years to go to work.
Indeed. And what are you going to do with the people who are already here? I mean, send them back to Mexico or Central America and have them wait 12 years until their time is up? No. I think there should be a process, a very reasonable process, to legalize these people and give them a path towards citizenship. I mean, and that involves like paying fines and paying back taxes and overall. But I mean, just the idea that rounding up 12 million people and send them back to their countries of origin is easier or more feasible is just lunatic.
The president said when he was in the United States, but he also said recently in the national address, that Mexico needs and wants these people to remain home and to help build the country. So you hear it quite often from American office holders that Mexico's playing a double game, that it wants these workers to go work in the United States because they generate large remittance income. But remittance income has also been dropping as the American economy has had its problems too. It's a real nest of nuts that are not easy to untie.
As long as the difference of incomes between Mexico and the United States remains 1 to 7, then you're going to have pressure for people to move from Mexico to the United States. So I think it's also something that Mexican authorities have to pay attention to. I mean, how do they create the conditions to get the economy growing, to make hundreds of thousands of jobs available for these youngsters? It's not only the blame of people in Washington that are sealing the border, but the blame of Mexican authorities. I read an article a few years ago comparing Mexican authorities to Tito back in Yugoslavia. He also had a policy of basically sending his people out because he couldn't give them jobs. So I think that the Tito problem of Mexico, it was called. And I think that Mexican authorities are also to blame because they can get their act together and the Mexican economy, with all these bottlenecks and all these high regulations and backward policies, is preventing the creation of jobs and sending his people out.
But Maureen, Juan Carlos, can the Mexican economy go green in the way that some people dream the United States can, and get some added economic boost out of that?
I think it's easier to actually get some investment in oil, in all these oil resources it already has, and exploit them well. As Francisco said, like we're talking here about millions of barrels of oil that are still underneath, and it's just a matter of getting investment into the industry and exploit them and have a well-run oil industry going on in Mexico. Unfortunately, the very timid efforts of President Felipe Calderon to allow private investment in the industry were blocked by Congress. And now they're just a pipe dream with the PRI having a large majority in Congress, a large plurality. And the idea of the PRI winning the elections in 2012, well, what would happen in that scenario? We don't know. The PRI is a very pragmatic animal. Let's remember that the PRI was the one who liberalized the economy back in the 1990s. So maybe...
And also nationalized the oil industry.
But also nationalized the oil industry. So it depends on where the wind is blowing. If they actually face a very critical situation where their cow milk is running out of milk, well, they will try to then get some hands and try to expand the potential of this industry.
You know, there's nothing more, well, one of the more depressing parts of being in Mexico is in an urban area, realizing as you're sitting in totally stuck traffic that all the thousands of cars around you are also sitting there idling, burning up unimaginable amounts of gasoline in a poor country that cannot muster the investment to build mass transit. And it's an open question whether aspirational Mexicans want to use mass transit. Now, in Mexico City, obviously, that's an exception. But if you're in other urban areas, the mass transit systems are very, very primitive, very undercapitalized. And you wonder if a country that is starting from scratch in many of these areas might do better rather than mimicking the United States.
The whole infrastructure in Mexico is backwards. I mean, if you have something to export to the United States and you're in the South, you have to go through Mexico City. There are no roads that skip Mexico City in order to make the transport lines easier towards the United States. So that leads to a lot of inefficiencies there.
They're also muttering among people like members of Congress about safety and Mexican inspection regimes for their trucks and that kind of thing. That while the Interstate Commerce Commission regulates what happens on American roads with American trucks, it can't reach over the border. Every time this argument comes up, I hear something about safety. Is that a fake, or what is that?
That's the new banner of protectionism all over the place. If you look at the safety statistics of Mexican truck drivers in the United States, they actually have a better record than their American peers, which shows that the safety concern is unfounded.
But does that become sort of a symbol of the unfulfilled promise of NAFTA, that even though this treaty regime was meant to, in many ways, erase the borders between the three countries, those borders are still very, very much in existence?
The problem is that when you have a free trade agreement, and I say free trade quote unquote because a free trade agreement will only be one sentence and saying like all chips and goods and services can be traded freely between both countries, period. When you have a free trade agreement, it's like a phone book, like 20 phone books. Then you have regulated trade, and then you have a lot of room for disputes, a lot of room for controversies like the one of the Mexican truck drivers. I think that overall CAFTA has been an enormous improvement over the situation in both countries, Mexico and the United States and Canada also. Investment has been coming to Mexico as never before. Jobs have been created in Mexico despite all the bottlenecks that we were talking about before, the infrastructure, lack of investment, and foreign direct investment has been flowing into Mexico, and jobs have been created. And the Mexican economy is stable now, despite the contraction last year because of the global downturn, because of the swine flu, because of the drug war violence. The Mexican economy is not experiencing those upswings that we saw 15 years ago before NAFTA was implemented. So I think that overall the record is quite good. However, there's a lot of room for improvement as long as all these other regulations and restrictions on free trade remain in place.